Turmoil in Europe defined much of the 20th century, resulting in two world wars and providing much of the impetus for the creation of a unified Europe. Now, not yet 2 decades into the 21st century, journalist and author James Kirchick says that the disorder on that continent is reminiscent of the 1930s. He is a fellow with the Foreign Policy Initiative, that's an American think tank, and his new book is called The End of Europe: Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age, and it brings James Kirchick to our studio tonight. Boy, you're in a bad mood. You're awfully pessimistic, Jamie. What's going on?
Well, if you look at so many different factors, it seems that the ugly traditions of Europe are coming back, whether it's nationalism, anti-Semitism, Russian aggression, illiberalism of all stripes, populism, economic stagnation. It's not a very pretty picture.
Well, here's how you describe it in the book. You say, we are on the cusp of witnessing the end of Europe as we have known it for the past 7 decades. A place of peace, stability, prosperity, cooperation, democracy, and social harmony. Europe today is breaking apart. It is increasingly undemocratic, economically stagnant, threatened by extremists of all stripes, from the illiberal left to the authoritarian right, and slowly heading down the once unfathomable path to war. In some ways, the region's geopolitical turmoil evokes the perilous 1930s. Now, I don't have to tell you, it is always, speaking of perilous to make comparisons to Nazi Germany, the 1930s. Right. Why are you comfortable going there?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's the same in every respect. But if you look at, for instance, a country like Hungary, where the prime minister, and Hungary is a member in good standing of the European Union and NATO, and we have a prime minister who 3 years ago openly called for a liberal democracy. And that's proceeding apace in that country. And in fact, those attitudes seem to be spreading. In Poland, there's a similarly nationalist government that is introducing many illiberal laws. We have Russia, which is waging a war in Ukraine for 3 years. People seem to have forgotten this. After they had illegally annexed Crimea, which was the first violent seizure of territory on the European continent since World War II. And it was done for the same exact reasons, I should add, that Adolf Hitler took the Sudetenland, which was Vladimir Putin claiming, my ethnic comrades in this country are being oppressed, and I therefore need to take this territory. And I don't think that the response from Western governments, either in Europe or in North America, has been adequate to meet the threat that we're facing from the Russians.
More on that later.
Yeah.
What's the spark, if there was one, that you saw that took us from where we were, namely the United States of Europe and no wars and we're all going to get along and share a currency and, as Seinfeld would say, yada, 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 to where we are right now?
Well, there are several. I mean, obviously the financial crisis of 2008 played a huge role, and that can't be underestimated. And when economies are not doing well, people are more susceptible, I believe, to the kind of siren calls of demagogues. In a country like France, where there's 10% unemployment and has been for years, and the youth unemployment is even higher, it's about 40%. You, unsurprisingly, will see people attracted to a candidate like Marine Le Pen. As far as Russia goes, I think we were just very complacent for many years in thinking that Russia wanted to be a part of the community of nations and that it respected the rules of the game. And clearly, you can go back in 2008 when they invaded Georgia, and I think it was clear at that point, if not earlier, that Russia was not happy with the post-Cold War settlement and that Vladimir Putin wants to see Russia play its traditionally sort of imperialist role again in Europe. But we sort of deluded ourselves into thinking that Russia could be a partner. And then 6 years later, he went into Ukraine. And now I think the threat could potentially be against a NATO country. So I think we were just very complacent about Europe. And we thought that after 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, we could just sort of, move on, that Europe was settled, it was done. Europe would be forever be a peaceful place with social harmony and would sort of be a model for the world. And I think that we now need to go back to Europe and we need to be involved again.
Do you think the average European has been better off as a result of the creation of the European Union?
Absolutely. I mean, you can look at the past hundreds of years of European history. Europeans have never experienced better livelihoods, whether it's economic. They've never experienced a more democratic society than under the aegis of some form of European integration. And that's even more true, I would say, in Central and Eastern Europe, which is why it's so strange that in countries like Poland and Hungary, there's this backlash against the European Union, when the best years that Poles and Hungarians and Czechs and Romanians and on, the best years that they've ever had have been the past 27 years of integration into Europe. And that's the same for French and Germans as well.
And yet the Brits voted to leave, and there is
They did.
disquiet all over the place.
They did. And in Britain, we should be cognizant that Britain was never really a fully paid-up member of the EU. It didn't join the European Economic Community until 1973, and that was after attempts by the French, actually, to keep them out of it. So they've always had this sort of tempestuous relationship. Even when they were members of the EU, they were not in the euro. They were never in the euro. They were not in the Schengen zone, which is the passport-free region on the continent. So they're leaving, while it's something that I don't like, and it's something that I think could be very bad for the EU going forward. It is not of the same severity as, say, France potentially leaving the EU, which could happen if Marine Le Pen becomes president of France.
Let me pick up on something you said a second ago, which is, in essence, that you think that American political leaders thought the European project was sort of well on its way, and therefore they could afford to kind of not pay as much attention to it. Why do you think American leaders have been as disengaged on the European file as they have been? I mean, there's always, obviously, in a post-9/11 world, everybody is extremely focused on terrorism, but there's been terrorism in Europe.
Yes.
So what would account for the lack of interest?
I think Europe was seen as boring after the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War was the centerpiece of global politics, and Germany was right in the heart of it. And so if you were someone interested in global affairs, and you were an American, you would become a French specialist or a German specialist, and you would serve, or you'd be in the military and you'd be deployed to Germany, where there are hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. And I think once the Cold War ended, Asia was seen as the new region of the world to specialize in, and also the Middle East.
And the Obama administration had this famous pivot to Asia.
The pivot to Asia as well. And I think that there was just a lot of complacency about Europe. And I think it was also a deep misunderstanding of Russia. And we've lost our expertise on Russia. We used to have a bevy of Russian experts and Russian speakers and Kremlinologists and people who understood Soviet studies, and they would specialize in different regions of the Soviet Empire. And we've lost that entire knowledge base, so and I think we need it back.
You yearn for the days of the Cold War, when we had that kind of special knowledge
Well,
back
I don't
in play.
yearn for it because I don't want to be in it, but I think we are in one again. We are in some new type of Cold War with the Russians, and we have been for a while. The Russians certainly believe we're in one, and they've been engaged in it, and I think we're finally waking up to it.
If the European Union is unraveling, huge if, but if it is unraveling, what do you think that would mean for the United States and its world leadership?
I think it would be the biggest foreign policy disaster of the United States, because a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace has been the greatest American foreign policy achievement, and Canadian as well. I mean, Canada has also followed a similar trajectory as the United States in Europe. You also fought in World War II. You were also engaged in NATO.
We were in it before you guys, actually.
Yeah, and you played a very important role in NATO and supporting the EU as well. So I think North Americans more broadly have played a huge role in securing Europe. And it's necessary that the United States continue to play this role. And what worries me about this new administration is that we have a president who seems to be at best apathetic, if not openly hostile, to the idea of European integration. And he favored Brexit, and he said that he would be happy to see Brexit plus. Presumably that means more countries leaving the EU. And he's made these very derogatory remarks about NATO over the course of the past year and a half.
Let's be fair. Let's be fair. I mean, the fact is, what comes out of his mouth one day may be completely contradicted by the same president the next day after he's learning on the job, right?
But that's a real problem, because you want some consistency from the U.S. president, who's supposedly the leader of the free world. You want some consistency on very basic issues. Two of those basic issues is that European integration is good for the United States. It's good for Europeans to have a strong, politically integrated Europe, and also that the United States should support NATO. NATO is the most successful military alliance in the history of mankind. It prevented a third world war on the European continent by basically sending a message to the Russians, you can't cross this line. And now we have this ambiguity from the President of the United States, who seems to really view NATO as a piggy bank. And if the piggy bank is full, then he's happy with it. And if it isn't full, then he has problems. He met the Secretary General of NATO in Washington, and he said it's no longer obsolete, which I'm glad to hear. But I still haven't heard him say why NATO itself is a good thing for the United States, irrespective of how much money our European allies are spending on defense. I haven't yet heard that from him.
Well, maybe you need James Mattis to have another conversation with him.
I think we're very lucky in that there are several very qualified, smart, capable people around him on the security and foreign policy front who seem to be having a positive influence in this regard.
Let's take one of those members that Donald Trump wishes were putting more into the piggy bank, and that's Germany. It's hard to imagine that the European project could be unraveling as you see it happening, with Germany not at the center of it or the cause of it, because it's been the cause of so much misery in the world over the last 100 years, 100 plus years. And yet there's Germany playing a stabilizing influence, a politically stable country, in many ways a light unto nations, the way they responded to the refugee crisis and so on. So you can't put it at Germany's feet, right? What kind of role are they playing in all of this?
Well, Germany has played a very positive role. It's still probably one of the most pro-European countries. But with what's happened in the United States has put Germany into a very uncomfortable position because Germans, for understandable historical reasons, are really averse to viewing themselves as world leaders. They don't like that. But I think they have to take a bigger leadership role. The Second World War was 75 years ago, and Germans have done an excellent job of looking at their history and owning up to it. But oftentimes that slips into an excuse not to lead more, particularly when it comes to military matters. And so Germans are spending far below the 2% of GDP on defense. They continue to be somewhat soft towards Russia.
So you agree with the president that they ought to pay more for defense and be tougher on Russia?
Well, I don't think the president wants them to be tougher on Russia. He does want them to pay more on defense, and Chancellor Merkel has pledged that Germany will spend more on defense. But it's interesting, if you look at a country like Poland or the Baltic states, countries that had a very bad history with Germany, they are now clamoring for more German defense spending. They want German troops on their soil as a buffer or a deterrent against Russia. So I think it's time for the Germans to really kind of own up to the fact that they are one of the world's leading democracies. They're the biggest country in Europe, and they need to play a more assertive role.
You would acknowledge, though, I think, that given the neighborhood they're in and given their history, they've got to be careful, right? On the one hand, they're an ally of the United States. On the other hand, you got Russia right there.
Yeah.
And they got to kind of pussyfoot around with Russia a little bit, don't they? Pussyfoot's not the technical term I'm looking for. You'll find a better term.
There's I think accommodate. And there's this accommodationist streak in German foreign policy that I talk a lot about in the book. It's actually it's the third chapter is about Germany and their attitudes towards Russia. Look, Germany has allies in Eastern Europe. Poland and the Baltic states and Czech Republic and Slovakia, they are NATO allies of Germany. And I think that those countries' interests in resisting Russian domination, Russian influence, should take a higher precedence in German foreign policy making than offending the Russians. I think Russia presents the greatest external threat to the European Union and to Western democracy.
Let me use your words here. You say Russia today is a more unpredictable adversary than was the Soviet Union.
Yes, I think with the Soviet Union, they're actually very conservative in some ways, in the sense that their leadership was composed of a presidium of kind of communist apparatchiks who were conservative in how they would behave, and they were somewhat predictable. Now we have a system in Russia where it's really one man who rules the country. And it's difficult to know what he's going to do.
Do you think one of the things potentially on his agenda is the reinsinuation of Russian forces into the Baltic states?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I do. Potentially it could be. And look, if he does do something like that in the Baltic states, it's going to be similar, I think, to what we saw in Crimea, the little green men, soldiers without insignia. And that way he has sort of plausible deniability. And you can say, well, these aren't Russian soldiers. They're local defense forces, or they're Russians who happen to be on vacation. So all the excuses that were used.
Tanks aren't going to roll in.
No, I don't think it's going to be tanks. It's not going to be a conventional military threat. And look, Estonia already had, in 2007, people forget this, there was a cyber attack on Estonia, where they shut down the country's banking institutions and government websites and media.
Which I learned from your book was particularly harsh for them because they were so advanced in cyber technology.
Estonia, they're known as Estonia. They invented Skype, and they're a very kind of technologically forward-thinking society. And so they were very vulnerable to this. And this was in 2007. This was years before we saw the Russians do what they're doing now across Western democracies, hacking in the United States election and interfering in our elections. And they're doing they're launching similar operations across Western Europe, in France and in Germany as well.
Why do you think it is so in the interest of Russia to destabilize Europe? They're part of Europe.
They are, but I think Vladimir Putin sees democracy as a threat, and he wants to make the world safe for Russian corruption. And this is why I think Ukraine is such a fundamental struggle right now, because the Ukrainians basically said, look, we're tired of being in this gray area between Europe and Russia. We're sick of the corruption. We're sick of the Russian meddling in our country. We want to join Europe. And the movement, the Maidan movement that overthrew the pro-Russian president, was in reaction to his refusing to sign a trade deal with the EU. And so once Ukraine made this movement towards the West, Putin realized, look, I can't have a 46 million Russian-speaking country that's a democracy and that's pro-Western on my border, because that will send a message to Russians that perhaps they should have democracy too, that perhaps Russian-speaking peoples can live in a democratic liberal society. And that's what he fears. And so that's why he went into Ukraine and took Crimea, and why he's waging a war, and why he wants to make Ukraine a failed state. Because if he can make Ukraine a failed state on Europe's border, then he can send the message to his own people, look, this is what democracy means. Democracy is civil war, it's fascists in Kiev, it's chaos, it's instability. That's the message that he wants to send, and that's why I think Ukraine is so vital for us in the West to support.
That may go some distance to answering the next question I was going to ask, but maybe I'll ask you to embellish a bit on it anyway, because you do point out in the book that Germany was once, of course, the most hugely destabilizing country in Europe. The world went to war twice because of German adventurism. And I think the suggestion is, like, why couldn't Russia be more like Germany?
Yes.
Okay, so what's the answer? Why can't Russia be more like Germany?
This goes to the question of history. If you look at a country like Germany, yeah, it killed millions of people and it threatened all of its neighbors. Yet look at Germany today. All of Germany's neighbors admire it. They want closer relations with it. They send their students to learn German and to study and work there. No one fears Germany militarily. Mm-hmm. There's not one country that borders Russia about which you can say the same thing. They all live in fear of Russia. And I think that has a lot to do with history. Germans, as I said earlier, have examined their history. You visit Berlin and you see the memorials and you can't escape it. They're very honest with themselves about what they did. In Russia, it's the complete opposite, where now Stalin is regarded as a hero and the Soviet Union was considered a great thing. And so Russians haven't come to terms with their past in the way that Germans have. And I think this is a crucial point in understanding why Russia is where it is today and why Germany is where it is today.
And presumably it's unimaginable that those circumstances will change as long as Vladimir Putin is in the Kremlin.
Absolutely. Vladimir Putin said years ago that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Now, if you talk to Poles or you talk to people from the Baltic states or Romanians or Bulgarians, they would beg to differ. They would see it as a liberation. But I think as long as you have a leader in the Kremlin who looks fondly and nostalgically upon the era of Russian imperialism and domination of its neighbors, then Russia is not going to change, unfortunately.
Although I have to say yes or no. From what I understand, the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution is coming up this fall, and it's going almost unmarked. They are not engaging in a sort of orgy of, boy, those were the good old days.
I think that's because if there's one thing Vladimir Putin fears most, it's revolution.
Another revolution.
It's revolution. And it's odd now because when you think of Russia, you think it was the great revolutionary power. It was exporting Marxist-Leninist revolution around the world. Now Russia has become a counter-revolutionary power, where you had a Maidan revolution in Ukraine, and they tried to stamp that out. In Libya, this had a huge effect on Vladimir Putin, was the downfall of Gaddafi, because I think he fears a similar uprising in his own country. And it's why the security state in Russia has hardened so tightly. And you see that any sort of democratic protest that is held in Russia, hundreds of people are arrested, like they were several weeks ago.
Yeah. All right. Having laid out the case in the end of Europe for your thesis, let's read one more excerpt from the book, and then we'll talk about what we can do about this, if anything. Today, you write, while the threats to freedom may be more diffuse, they are no less potent. And yet, moral relativism and self-doubt sap Western will at every turn. The consequences of such abdication are dire. If the values of America and Europe do not continue to shape the future as they have its recent past, then those of authoritarian powers like Russia will. All right, so that's where we are. What do you want us to do about it?
We need to stand up for democracy and liberal values. And it's why, if you want to talk about a dark age, I mean, you look at the President of the United States called up the Turkish President Erdogan to congratulate him on
winning
this referendum in Turkey, which will move Turkey into basically dictatorship. This is a really bad signal to have a U.S. president who I don't think in any of his speeches talks about things like liberty, democracy, freedom. I mean, these are words that U.S. presidents always have said in their speeches. Whether or not they fulfilled those pledges and goals is a different question, but they always at least held out this sort of ideal. And now we have an American president who seems to have an affinity for dictators, who can't seem to say anything negative about a man like Vladimir Putin, who congratulates a Turkish neo-sultan. It's really bad when America abdicates this role, because I'm not sure who else is big enough or strong enough or influential enough to promote those values. I mean, certainly, Canada can try, but you're a much smaller country and you don't have the means.
But the fact is, we are where we are. You've got Donald Trump as your president for the next 3 years plus. So what do you want to do about it?
Well, I think it's important for those of us who live in democratic societies to support other democratic societies and people struggling for freedom.
But what does that? I really need to know, Jamie, what that means. Does that mean that if Putin starts getting more adventurous about things in Western Europe, are we supposed to go to war with him?
Well, I don't think we're going to have to go to war with Russia. We are much stronger than Russia, and by we I mean the NATO alliance. If you look at the military spending of the combined NATO members, it's I think something like 9 times higher than that of Russia. So when we are united, we're much stronger than them. And so we can deter them if they ever want to do anything against a NATO country. The problem is that when we're divided, we're not. And this is what the Russians are trying to do. They're trying to divide and rule. It's why they're trying to bring Marine Le Pen to power in France. It's why they supported Brexit. It's why they're supporting all sorts of disruptive and disintegrative political forces. It doesn't matter if they're on the left or the far right. Whoever opposes the EU, whoever is anti-American, anti-NATO, you will see Russian money or propaganda or trolls behind the scenes. And so we need to stand together and we need to be more united in dealing with these illiberal forces, whether it's Putin or Erdogan or those in our own society.
I wonder, though, whether you take any solace from the fact that they had elections in the Netherlands not too long ago, and the public was expected in an orgy of populism to put Geert Wilders into power, and he did much less well than people thought he would.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't read too much into this. He was not expected to ever enter into government. He was expected to get perhaps a plurality of the votes. He didn't.
He didn't.
On the other hand, he got more votes than he did in the last election. Geert Wilders has also been around for a long time. I think he's the 3rd longest serving member of their parliament. So while I was gladdened by the results, the Netherlands is a small country, and I wouldn't read too much into the results there. It's the French elections that are a much bigger deal.
So I hear you saying we've got to stay united, but you have divided government in the United States. That's just the reality. It may be the same party, but it's not. We all know it's not. So I think we need kind of a clearer prescription. Speak with a united voice, push back against efforts to destabilize Europe. Okay, that's all good. But at some point, push comes to shove, and then I need to know what we're supposed to do.
Well, it may end up being that certain European countries are going to have to, or Canada are going to have to assume a burden that they're not used to assuming. And so, I mean, Canada is also one of these countries that doesn't spend as much as it should be on its military.
Yep.
I believe it's like 1.3%, maybe even less than that. You may see countries like Germany having to assume a larger burden. But this is why I'm so pessimistic, is because as we've seen in European history, when individual European countries are put into the position where they need to take on more nationalist policies, it doesn't lead anywhere very good. And this is why the American abdication is such a problem, because Europe has, the precondition for European integration has been the American presence on the continent. The reason why after World War II you didn't see France and Germany fighting again over Alsace-Lorraine is because they were part of a supranational structure. The European Economic Community, but also NATO, that made these sort of petty atavistic nationalisms, it neutralized them. And if America and Canada pull back from this, then I think you will see the return of nationalism to the European continent. And I think we're already seeing that.
I can't recall the last time I read a book and said to myself so many times while reading it, I sure hope he's wrong. I sure hope he's wrong.
I do too. I hope I'm wrong too.
Well, so we have that in common then. James Kirchick, The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. Really good of you to come up to Toronto and visit us
Absolutely.
here at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.